I took what may be considered silly primary assignments very seriously. I've always been very studious, even if the other kids thought, well, that's nerdy or not cool. The only conception I have of that was something's not right with me, not the church. And that was very much, and I think is even more so now, church culture.
So common.
I am going to be a failure, a failed RM. And the church did not teach anything about how to deal with that. I had no frame of reference for now what do I do? And for me, one of my life lessons I feel like is having to learn to find an identity for myself independent of the church, because I didn't know what that looked like before really
Right.
my mission.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to episode 42 of the Clarity Podcast. I'm your host, Claire, and this week's guest was Jay Ford. And Jay comes all the way from Idaho. He came out here to interview with me, and Jay's story ranges from his mission and coming home early from his mission to waking up to so many things in the church and really just following the hero's journey to find out who the hero really is in our story. Stay tuned for all this and more on this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast. Everyone has a journey they're walking. And along that road, we are met with potholes, road bumps, rain, storms, and sometimes just fog. But through it all, we're really just looking for one thing: clarity. Clarity so we can walk with confidence in that next step. There's one source I run to for that clarity. In the darkest of nights, Jesus offers me light that shines through even the thickest storms. Welcome to the Clarity Podcast, where we find clarity through the one who saves us all. And welcome to episode 42 of the Clarity Podcast. I'm your host, Claire, and this week's guest is Jay Ford. Welcome to the podcast, Jay.
Greetings. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for coming. So you drove out here from Idaho, right?
I did.
All right. We are so grateful that you were willing to make that drive. The coolest part is meeting people from long distance who have so many similar values and lessons that they've learned, and we're all just trying to, spread the message of Jesus. So grateful that you made the drive out today.
Thank you.
All right. So go ahead, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and how old you are.
Yep. So I'm Jay Ford. I'm 41. I'm actually from Salt Lake originally. My hometown is Riverton in the Salt Lake Valley. And I'm married. I've been married to my wife, Karen, for a little over 18 years now. We have 7 kids, 5 boys, 2 girls, from 15 down to 4.
Wow, you have a big family.
Yep.
All very young family too.
They keep us busy.
Oh yeah, I believe
for
it.
Sure. Mm-hmm. But yeah, like you mentioned, we live in southeast Idaho now, just north actually of Preston in the Bear River Valley. A small unincorporated community called Thatcher. Maybe 200, give or take.
Wow, that's small. That's like smaller than here.
It is. More cows than
people. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, cool. What do you do for a living, Jay?
So I'm in tech. I'm actually a software tester, or formerly a quality assurance engineer. And so I work on testing websites, applications, depending on what company or what team I'm on, find defects, bugs. I do a little bit of programming for automated tests, a lot of things techie.
Cool. All right. Let's transition into your childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you were raised in Salt Lake, right?
Yep.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead and tell us about what you were like as a child and what part religion played in your childhood.
I'm the oldest of 4 boys. I've got 3 younger brothers. My next youngest brother is 3 years younger, and then there's a 10-year gap and basically another pair. And so often it felt like being an only child. My next brother and I didn't get along super well, at least when we were younger. But yeah, growing up in Riverton was, I would call it an idyllic, carefree childhood. If there's one word I'd use to describe my childhood there, it'd be carefree. The church played a huge part in my upbringing. Both my parents were very active members, still are. They got married from what I recall in 1981. I was there first in 1983, born in Provo, Utah, as I like to say, probably the baby capital of the world, from an LDS perspective, at
No
least.
kidding. Yep.
So I grew up with my younger brother until I was a little bit older and had a few other brothers. But my parents moved around a few times after I was born. They actually went to California for about a year or so, and there were probably 3 or 4 different places. I don't have much memory of that because I was quite young. The main point is they moved to Riverton, where they still are, in 1990, and that's where most of my childhood memories are. Growing up, I was pretty much homeschooled. My dad did what he could. There weren't nearly the amount of resources that there are now, especially with online schooling and how it has transformed, both with technology and, again, just culture. But that was something that was very unique for me as a child, too, growing up, because that made the church that much bigger in my life.
Okay, so that's my next question then. So maybe tell us the dynamic between your home life and your church life, because it is a pretty common thing in church culture that like the gospel's kind of a Sunday thing. And it wasn't even necessarily that in my home, but I just saw that a lot in the families in my neighborhood. So what was that like for you? Were you guys actively living the gospel in your home as well? Tell us a little bit about that dynamic.
With the consideration I was homeschooled too, I had no real concept of what was trendy or cool then. And in a lot of ways, being sheltered was really a blessing.
Yeah.
Looking back, like, I had no idea I was not trendy or had the cool things or the cool clothes. I did have parachute pants, like whatever is comfortable type of thing. My parents were pretty diligent about family home evening and, as I recall, youth activities in primary. I went through the standard, I'm sure, nursery, primary. I remember all the standard church classes like that. And I think it was much bigger to me. I took even what may be considered silly primary assignments very seriously. I've always been very studious. Even if the other kids thought, well, that's nerdy or not cool, I did not care. And I was blissfully unaware in a lot of ways. And so church was huge, both going to church on Sunday. I always, as I recall, at least as a kid, looked forward to it. I was probably overly eager compared to some of the other kids. And a lot of that was because I was at home so much. To me, it was a different environment and a novel environment, which was, for me, great. That probably is a good transition, too, if it's appropriate to go into baptism.
Yes, absolutely. So tell us about your baptism. Were you baptized at 8?
Yep. I was baptized probably within a month of turning 8. And that is very interesting to look back on, because at the time, I really did not understand what it was I was committing to.
Right.
I understood a lot more, again, about Super Mario and about Power Rangers, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Like, those were
Which is understandable
heroes
for an
I looked
8-year-old,
to.
right? Like, most 8-year-olds don't understand why we would be baptized. Like,
I do remember a little bit about the baptism itself. I remember my parents were there, a lot of the ward members. I do remember that to some degree. I don't remember much of my overall feelings. I don't remember being really concerned about, I've committed these sins or whatnot. I mean, as an 8-year-old, my sins are going to be washed away.
What sins do you have when you're 8?
Right. I beat too many of my friends in games or was selfish. I didn't have too many.
You're 8.
I stole candy, maybe a candy piece. Like, it's pretty squeaky clean. That's a common theme in my life. I really had very little concept of the significance of what I was doing in terms of I am committing for my life and eternity, really, to follow Jesus Christ and what that meant, like what promises and overall covenants I was making. As I got more into my teen years, the church was still very big because I didn't get into any formal high school type course until later on. Got to age 12, and that was a significant milestone for me, and I'm sure for most LDS boys in general, because now you get interviewed for the Aaronic priesthood. And that was something I took very seriously.
So I want to delve into this a little bit because you mentioned this in your pre-notes. So what were your feelings of like, what is sin and how do you feel about that? And did you have an understanding of repentance? Was there a fear base there? Maybe tell me kind of some of your thoughts there and what you were going through as a teenager with those things.
I felt, again, especially with receiving the Aaronic priesthood, like this weight of responsibility. And I did not fully understand, again, like from baptism, what that meant. I thought a lot about sin, repenting, forgiveness. I had what I would probably call religious scrupulosity. The general term, as I understand it, means you're obsessive about religious aspects, whether it's about following teachings or standards or just having it so large in your life that it can become disruptive, like to your mental well-being. And so I would say I had some of that, like in the sense that I did really ruminate over that at times, like, how do I know I'm forgiven? How do I know like the proper process to repent? I felt like the church in some ways even then was very surface level when it came to that. And I felt like, again, being more sheltered, a lot of my peers didn't think a whole lot about that. Not to their discredit. That was just kind of the general culture then. But for me, I had a lot more free time to myself. And that was probably part of that because I did take that very seriously.
So I feel like you're describing kind of like a worthiness complex.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I would definitely say I had an overall worthiness complex. Perhaps one of the downsides of being kind of sheltered was that I was left to my own thoughts with that often. I would say I was fairly close, like with my parents, and they were pretty open about general subjects overall in church subjects. And I felt like I could typically approach them with concerns I had. At the same time, I did internalize a lot of that. And I would say, looking back, I feel kind of sad, like sympathy for my younger self, because where I'm at now, I feel like I would have a lot more wisdom. Obviously, it's 25 plus years of a difference, but I have kids now too that I can hopefully teach them with some of those lessons now. But I do remember, just kind of a side note, but it plays into it, like feeling very nervous. I was painfully shy often, very nervous interacting with girls in general. I, in a sense, probably put them on this pedestal. And there's an interesting dynamic, even now, I would say, with church culture between boys and girls with that, and purity culture. And for me, I was ignorant of some of that, like some of the pressure the girls were under. I'm sure you experienced growing up, because you had some of these lessons that we just didn't. Like, we didn't have the chewed gum lessons as far as I recall, or the flower. What is it, like the flower petals all scattered,
the licked cupcake lesson.
Right, all of that. I don't remember that. For us, it was pressure in a different way, I would say, in the sense of, do not let the priesthood down. Like, you have a solemn duty to be the example type of thing. And I was terrified at times because I'm like, I don't even know if I'm living up to the standards I need to be. It was very duty driven, service driven in terms of the priesthood.
I think that now that is almost becoming more and more watered down. Like, there's less duty. There's less, like, for both of the genders, there's less responsibility to be moral, to fulfill your duty, to do the things that are right, because we don't want to make these kids feel bad and we want these kids to be comfortable so they can come to church. Right. So it's almost like a flip flop in that we've really watered it down in the church now, at least from what I'm seeing in perspectives, from what, people your age were getting, where, they were really doubling down. And it's interesting because I think there's like a happy medium ground we can hit in the church where we're teaching correct principles, but then we're also teaching grace instead of these extremes that I think we're hitting.
I would definitely agree with that. There is and was a different dynamic from what there is now. But I did want to go into, if it's appropriate too, with my teen years, with youth conference also. I have numerous memorable experiences with that. I'll just highlight a few because, again, that was such a core experience. Youth conference was even bigger to me, again, with not having as many other events. I did play soccer and I had recreational leagues, things like that. But really, scouting and youth conferences were the highlight of my church teen years in terms of memorable, like week-long type events. The youth conferences were very significant to me. That's where I would credit a lot of that time to developing what I would term as a testimony. My home Riverton ward there, they were so great overall. Like the leaders, the parents, the teachers, really overall were very genuine, I would say, and desirous to help us to gain that testimony and to learn and grow. My main point there was that was just very significant to me because I felt like it did lend to establishing the foundation of lifelong positive habits.
Okay, so your brother-in-law is Jason, who's a childhood friend. So did you know your wife from a very young age then?
I did and I didn't.
Okay.
So she's 2 years younger. She's the next sibling.
Okay.
And I was aware of her, but I did not pay attention to her, if that's the appropriate term,
Okay.
when I was growing up.
Okay. So were you maybe starting to have an understanding of who Jesus Christ was in your teenage years going through some of these experiences?
I would say starting to, again, very rudimentary, like from what it was back then. A lot of my core identity with it revolving around the church really revolved around this worthiness and even purity culture to some degree, that how do I know I'm worthy enough? Or how do I know many are called but few are chosen? How do I know I can be chosen? And I would dwell on that at times. And from what I recall, I had some spiritual highs, like kind of pioneer track to some degree. I remember with all of the youth conferences, whether during or after the fact, we had like these testimony meetings. And I felt the Spirit so strongly. I cried. Like it was really intense and socially acceptable within that environment. Because generally, at least back then, boys don't cry. I have a different view on that now. But that's really how it was. Like the young men learned to bottle up a lot of those feelings. And for me, it was even more intense with feeling more like an outsider. And I remember having such an intense desire at times to know Jesus, to receive that personal revelation. And I got really serious, not just because of the youth conference and yay, candy and awards. I didn't really mention seminary, but that factored into it too. I was very intense about seminary. I couldn't understand why the other like high schoolers weren't as excited about like seminary, because I was like, I'm going through these scripture masteries. That was a time where I really came to appreciate the scriptures more. One of my favorites is Alma 48:17, I believe. Going back to that hero, not idolizing, but wanting to identify with a heroic story and heroic role models. And I guess to some degree, I could have said, well, at the time it probably would have been President Hinckley could have been that, but he was like 10 levels above, like close to Jesus level. And I'm not quite aspiring that high type of thing, but I specifically remember Alma 48:17, like Captain Moroni, with it saying, yea, verily, verily, I say unto you, if all men had been and were and ever would be like unto Moroni, yea, the very powers of hell would have been shaken forever. Yea, the devil would never have power over the hearts of the children of men. That was another stepping stone, I feel like, to my desire for a very personal relationship with Jesus.
Definitely.
I remember very much identifying with wanting at least to aspire to be like Moroni, or even his right-hand man like Tiancum, and just feeling like I have so far to go. In a lot of ways, I still do now. But I feel like I have a more mature view now of it. I remember going to, from what I can recall, it was like a youth or young men, young women fireside, something like that. I still remember the stake center, the location where I was sitting, where it may have been the state president or just one of like the adult leaders. They were talking about the creation and Genesis, to some degree, probably mentioning like Adam and Eve, but I specifically remember at the time the leader said, and God did not pronounce creation complete until the crown jewel that was woman. In general, that's a very beautiful thing that, yes, with humanity, women especially, like I respect very highly. And obviously like my wife now and my mother. And so I feel like I have a more mature, healthier view of that. At the time as a teen, I felt like that was kind of twisted. And I literally interpreted that as, that must be one of the reasons why I came as a male, that I wasn't as righteous. Like
Whoa, that is
in the
so
premortal
interesting
life.
because there's this thing with the young women where we're like, these young men, they know everything about the gospel, but you're speaking and you're experiencing the opposite. The women know everything about the gospel. So what emotional effect did that have on you as a teenager?
A huge one. I felt like I wasn't worthy enough to even give voice to that, at least to my leaders. And just with the girls and women in general, I felt like I just wasn't eloquent enough, or I didn't have enough of a social ability to have these meaningful, deep conversations. And so I just internalized a lot of that. And I just remember thinking, well, I just need to do better. I felt like I didn't know how to achieve those heroic levels that I desired. Like I didn't know how to be good enough. And I didn't know how to articulate that, at least to my parents, even and my leaders. And the irony is, I'm sure you could ask any one of my leaders and they would say, well, Jay was a great example. Jay was one of the spiritual ones, not because I was necessarily more mature, but I wanted to not just look good. I wanted to be good, but not in the sense of just for show. Like I had a genuine desire for that, again, personal relationship with Jesus. But I felt like I went through these cycles. And if there was one piece of advice that I would give, especially to the younger generation, and my kids are in that next younger generation, it's to know that you do have inherent overall worth. And it's not based on how many gold stars you get or how many A's. It's knowing that, it may sound cliche, but we are all children of heavenly parents, of father and mother. Jesus is literally our older brother who can help us. And we can know our overall sense of self-worth through Jesus. I may be jumping ahead a bit, but that was very intense for me at the time, going through these teen years and just feeling like it's not good enough. And having what I recognize now is an unhealthy perfectionistic attitude about that and about really wanting to succeed with the church. And as I recall, I taught with Jason, my best friend, brother-in-law now, to some degree about that growing up, but how deep of conversations can you really have at that age, at least from my perspective? It's not like, hey, I'm having an identity crisis, or I just heard from, this stake leader that women are the crown jewel, and I have kind of this twisted perspective that I just wasn't good enough. And so that's why I'm here as a guy. Like that would make no sense to your average teen at the time. I'm not saying that to discredit like my friends. That's just how it was. I would say probably especially for the young men. They were talking about movies and video games and cute girls and whatnot. Not, hey, let's delve into like the scriptures or these spiritual topics. But
So briefly tell us your interactions with Karen in high school, and then we'll transition into your mission.
Yep. I started getting to know her a little bit, at least in high school. And we really didn't talk a whole lot. My in-laws did joke because I was always over there. They were like a second family to me. We were in the same ward. And in the Salt Lake Valley, the same ward basically means the same neighborhood because it's so close together. So they literally, and my in-laws do still literally live just like half a block away around the corner from my parents. And so I was over at their house very much, even from a kid onward, because I was always hanging out with my best friend Jason at the time. And I'm probably just getting to the point now where I'm paying them back in terms of all the food I ate there, because I was always eating over there. So those are actually more of the earlier memories I have, at least of my in-laws, just eating with them, because there were a few younger siblings, younger sister-in-law and brother-in-law now. And then we get to high school, and we had, this was probably more like in pre, so it's probably more like 16, 17. And we had a traditional annual like priest Halloween date activity. Like our leader at the time like owned a mortuary. It may seem kind of weird now, but it was like, hey, fun Halloween activity at the graveyard or at the mortuary. And that may still be a sort of a thing now, but we had this yearly tradition where generally one or the other would ask the other on a date between the young men and young women. And for some reason, well, like I said, I was extremely shy then, and I did not have much of an overall interest in dating, let alone feeling like forced, like, okay, it's the priest activity, the combined activity, go get a date. And so from Karen's perspective, and she may tell you a little bit differently, but she was eating dinner with her family, and her dad was like, oh, the activity's coming up, the yearly Halloween date. And they started teasing her. And they were like, you should ask Jay. Like, they joked when I was younger, I was the adopted brother because I was over there so much anyway. And so I guess somewhere around that time, I must have blossomed a bit more, because I caught Karen's eye like, hey, he is kind of cute. And I guess she developed somewhat of a crush on me, and I didn't notice till later. But I remember my friend's dad, my father-in-law now, at the time, I think they dialed my family's number and gave Karen the phone, and she asked, well, would you like to go? And I'm like, okay, not knowing that backstory. But anyway, so that was technically our first date. And later on, she did actually, she asked me to that too. She asked me to a girls' craft dance at the high school. I was not into a lot of the high school culture. I freely admit I did not go to prom, and I did not have many feelings one way or the other about that. But that was really more of the beginning of our friend relationship that led into marriage. So I do remember she was very optimistic, cheerful, pretty outgoing. She was very much more extroverted. And I do remember being impressed by that. And again, to me, it was my best friend's younger sister. I think somewhere in the back of my mind, it was like, we don't go there. Like,
We don't go there.
That's off limits in terms of dating. And I wasn't even that interested in dating, at least when I was
because
even 16,
you have to go
17.
on a mission first.
Right.
Yeah.
That was ingrained in me that I can't get into serious relationships. I'm preparing for my priesthood duty. And that was very much a conditioned teaching, which isn't necessarily a bad thing depending on how you look at it. I had fun, like with the high school dates with Karen, but that was about the extent of it, aside from sharing Legend of Zelda or Ocarina of Time tips on how to beat it, like in Scouts. That was about the extent of it.
Okay.
Like,
all right. So let's put Karen on hold for a
Yeah.
minute. And now let's go on your 2-year mission. Okay. Tell us about your mission.
so it turned out a lot differently than what I thought it would.
Okay. So what did you think it was going to be versus what was it? And where were you called to serve?
I thought it was going to be 2 years for one. It was not, and I'll get into that
Okay.
in just a little bit.
Okay.
And I had this idyllic view of what it would be like that the field is white, ready to harvest, and we're ready to go out. And a notable, I would say, prerequisite to that, before I forget, was the prep leading up to that. Again, with common connection, Jason, my best friend, we went to mission prep classes. So we were probably getting to 18, because it was 19 back then that the young man went out. I don't remember a whole lot about mission prep, but I do have very vivid memories, of course, of temple prep, and that leading to taking out our endowments and our initiatory as well as endowment, because of course that's a prerequisite for the young men with going out on the mission. And both of us were ordained to the Melchizedek priesthood, as I recall, at 18 in our home ward, again there. Anyway, the main point that I recall was feeling some confusion. I didn't have a super negative experience, at least, of like the endowment itself. I did get my patriarchal blessing, I think, when I was 17. And for some reason, they kept using the term and word like gift along coinciding like with the endowment. And I had this misconception, not like obviously be like this physical gift, but it would, maybe again, that was part of a heroic complex or something, but thinking like they would select me for some spiritual gift. I had this incorrect notion that they would be like, you have the spiritual gift of courage. And then I would feel like courageous, like ever after, something like that. I don't even fully know, but anyway, I do remember some of the clothing was like, I don't really understand this. Like, I'm not understanding the symbolism, and it felt stressful just with all of the aspects of it, and exciting at the same time because we're getting prepared to do our duty. We're getting prepared to go on a mission. So that led to us getting our mission calls. And for some reason, my dad intercepted it and thought he'd play a prank. And I didn't think it was as funny at the time. But he actually sneakily, surreptitiously, like, opened my envelope. And he put an additional paper in. He must have typed it out or something. I'm like, why would you even do that? And he snuck in like a fake mission call. And it did fool us because we were over at Karen and Jason's parents, and both sets of our families were there. And Jason and I were sitting on the couch. We have the photos of it. This was when we were 19, 2002. And I opened mine up. And I remember pulling the paper out, and it's like, Dear Elder Ford, you are hereby called to serve in the Salt Lake City, like, South Mission. And I was like, what? Like,
You're like, no.
because we were in the Salt Lake Valley, and like the only worse call would be Boise, like if you're in Salt Lake. And I remember my dad just, from what I recall, just started laughing, and he was like, okay, that's not really it. And I was like, what? I just remember feeling this confusion. But my real call, and this is how I've joked, I know that God has a sense of humor, because it was to the Detroit, Michigan mission, my last name being Ford. I can't tell you how many times I had, well, you're in GM country up here. What's the Ford doing here? I'm like, that's where they told me to go. So it was kind of funny, but I got called there. My friend Jason got called to the Buenos Aires, Argentina South mission. I think we entered the MTC same time. It was like December 2002. We had Christmas there. He was in for about 8 weeks, and I was there for about 3 because his was Spanish and mine was English. So I remember feeling excited about it, but also just, I don't know how this is going to be. And the MTC was kind of a standard experience. I remember we had all you can eat food, and I probably needed to gain 10 plus pounds there because I was still pretty thin. I really loved at least my district. That's it. I loved them overall. We took a lot of great pictures, and I really learned a lot about more rigid schedules there and work ethic. And I started having some challenges that didn't become more apparent until after I got to Detroit to my mission, because I just felt like I was very stressed out, and I was wondering what is going on. Well, I'm just adjusting. I just kept saying that I'm just adjusting, and our district leader and his companion, they were actually going to Africa, and there were only a few of us in our district. There was some schedule mix up, so there were only actually a few of us going to Detroit. But we had some very special experiences there, and the district leader was actually Tanner Ainge, and I had no idea. This is how sheltered I was, but he is Danny Ainge's son. I had no idea who Danny Ainge was. Apparently, he was very well known in basketball. He really encouraged me there. So for the brief amount of time I was with him, he was super supportive, because I actually did have a few times where I was just so stressed out, like in the MTC. I realized in hindsight, I was just not prepared for that. I broke down a few times kind of privately after class, and he was like, for some reason, he took me aside. He was like, hey, I know this is very different. It's very rigorous. And he really buoyed me up, for which I'm very grateful, because I really only knew him in person for those few weeks. But if there's one thing I learned from that, it's that there are very special individuals in your life that you can interact with, even if it's just briefly. And he was one of those. And so for the rest of the time, I remember, I think we had Elder Scott. He came to the MTC like for Christmas. And I remember that was one of my first experiences, I feel like, having kind of like this celebrity, like general authority appearance, and how it turned more over the years into more of celebrity events. But in any case, I shook his hand, and it was not quite as significant as I had maybe thought it would be, but it was good. But so fast forward, we flew out, like those of us, the few of us going to Detroit, and I got assigned to my companion, and we were actually in a more ideal area, I guess you would say. We are in a driving zone. So I actually went to Grand Blanc, Michigan, which is a suburb, much like Salt Lake. And with all outward appearances, it was great. Like, it was, as they would say now, bougie. I had to ask what the definition of that was a while ago, because I did not know. But
That's okay. My parents just asked me the other day what bougie meant.
it was very cush. Like, it was a much more comfortable type of environment to be in. Mm-hmm. And that's what got me really concerned, because again, with all outward appearances, I was successful. I was flown out to the mission field. The field is white. Let's go tracting. And for a little while it worked, but I was just feeling horrible. I started feeling worse, like physically. I wasn't sleeping, and I had this, again, complex, like this worthiness complex of, I know there weren't serious sins, like there were not unresolved sins.
But you don't feel good, so all of a sudden you're like,
yeah.
I must be unworthy because I don't feel good.
So I started literally getting obsessed.
I relate.
About that.
Yep.
For sure. And I was just racking my brain, because I was just like, what is wrong? This is not how I envisioned it. Mm-hmm. This is not working. The problem was, I think, partially was I did not have as much of a conception of overall healthy self-care that I learned later, in terms of just good balance and understanding even things like anxiety and depression.
Well, and balance is not taught in society or in the church. In fact, Elder Bednar is now saying there's no such thing as balance.
I would highly disagree.
That's so false. Like, life is all about balance.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so I learned a lot of hard, but also good lessons from that. So basically, we were just doing the normal tracting, teaching. I did go on occasional, I think it was called splits at the time, but I guess the church thought that sounds weird, so we're going to relabel it to exchanges I think it's called exchanges now.
Interesting.
But at the time, it was called splits, I think. And we had like the district leaders. One of the times we even had the apes, we call them, the assistant to the mission president.
Okay. I was like, what?
It's an acronym, but we always just said apes. But we went on splits with them, and I had been out for a few months, and it was between like January to February. And so it was so cold. I didn't have warm enough clothes either. I think my mom was nice and like sent me another coat or something. But this was like 20 years ago, right? In hindsight, we didn't have as many privileges that I hear they have now. Like they can FaceTime every week or something like that.
I feel like they can, I don't know. They have a lot of privileges and they can Facebook message and like, it's very
a lot
strange
more.
now. Yeah.
Like at the time it was much more strict, and we were one of the more relaxed, as I recall, missions. We could do like whitelisted music like Motab, like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, and for some reason Enya was okay. So maybe that's why I still like Enya, like new age music. Not to digress, I appreciated that, and along with that, I was very much a rules follower. I was very genuine about I am out here for a reason, to bring people to Christ, to Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I started having somewhat of what I would probably say, a dissonance in the sense of like, I'm doing outwardly all the right things, but I'm not feeling super spiritual. I'm not feeling like the success of this, like the priesthood power I'm looking for.
So looking back with hindsight, do you feel like that was maybe like the first step of your awakening?
I would
You just
say
didn't know
probably unconsciously,
Subconsciously,
yes,
yeah.
or subconsciously. That's probably the more correct term. Looking back, like I probably would have been very fearful had I consciously had the thought, like, what if something's not right here? The only conception I have of that was something's not right with me, not the church. And that was very much, and I think is even more so now, church culture.
So common. So common.
Right. So we did have some successes, like we did tract, and we overall followed the rules. I feel so bad for my companion because I was one of the problem ones in the sense of seemingly needy or just emotionally unstable. And I was, but not really.
Is this because of your
fault.
health problems that you were having?
Yeah, just my health problems. And it manifested in terms of like racing thoughts or not being able to sleep, and started getting progressively worse physically, like headaches because I couldn't sleep, and just fatigue. And so that became the overarching thought process, like what is wrong, like with me? And like I said, I was obeying the rules too. The one time I can remember a minor infraction was out of frustration, like in our car, I turned on the radio and it was like whatever pop song at the time. He's like, "No, elder." And he turned it off. He's like berating me, like, "We follow the rules here." And like he was a good rule follower. But that shows like how extreme it got with me, because I was like, I don't care in a sense. Like I was just so frustrated because it was just compounding. So we did have some good overall experiences. Like we were tracting out in the cold and we ran away from dogs, and we just knocked on all these doors. And one of the times I think I was on splits at the time, exchanges now, but with like the zone leader. And one door we knocked on, it was a lady who was like kind of yelling at us, and she was like, "No, you're," probably said something like demonic or occult or something, and slammed the door in our face. And I remember being kind of surprised because my borrowed companion at the time, he was like, "Well, I'll see you in the spirit world then." I'm like, "Elder, how can you say that?" Like, they're real people too. Like he was frustrated because it's frustrating having so much rejection. And I guess you could argue it teaches resilience. But in any case, the point was, I was just like, what is wrong with me? I don't understand. And eventually it got bad enough. I broke down in tears, I think, again, in front of like the assistant to the presidents, the apes, and they were just like, something's not right. Like, this guy needs help. Because I was just like, I've had it. Like, I used to internalize all of it and I couldn't do it anymore. And I'm just like, this is not how I envisioned it. And I was feeling more and more guilt and shame. And that's something I dealt with as a teen throughout my teen years. And I did not have a healthy understanding of that in an overall balance. So point is, they actually sent me to, I think it was Ann Arbor, like to one of the hospitals there. And significantly now, looking back, it was an LDS, like psychologist. It was always, and it still is, I think, an LDS psychologist or medical professional, at least with what I understand still, of like the mission rules or whatnot. And they took me through a few psych tests, and I think he was just kind of baffled because he was, I think at the time, like, well, we can put you on this mess. And like, as best as he could determine, it was generalized anxiety, because it wasn't some of these significant like classic symptoms. Like, it wasn't OCD. I didn't have classic definition symptoms of like obsessive thoughts. So I did rituals, like the compulsive aspect. I didn't really have that. I did obsess at times, but it wasn't formalized in that sense. And as best as they could tell, they said, well, generalized anxiety, aka we can't figure out a significant enough problem, so we will categorize you in this catch-all term. I can smile a little more now, but at the time I was deadly serious. And I remember I was in the elevator with my companion, and I just said, I just want to go back home. Like, I was at that point, even to the point of having somewhat morbid type thoughts, like when we were driving, because I wasn't authorized to drive because he was a senior companion type thing. And I remember just thinking, I don't care if a car hits us. And that's a really scary thing, because I was never, even at my lowest point, I would say suicidal. But that's a very serious thing when an individual gets to that point where it's like, I'm not caring. Like, I'm not going to actively self-harm, in that sense. But anyway, so we had some successes. Like, we did the tracting, and even just a few funny things. But one older woman thought we were like Adam and Eve. We were all bundled up because it was very cold, and she kept calling me Eve, and we were like, no, we're missionaries. We had funny things like that. So point is, we had ups and downs, but we got to that point where I think, and I feel bad for him, but my companion was just like, this isn't working. And I got to the point where I was just like, I finally vocalized, I just want to go back home. And for me, it was just like that final straw, in the sense of like, I'm going to be a failure, a failed RM. And the church did not teach anything about how to deal with that. I had no frame of reference for, now what do I do? And I even had my companion in the MTC. I had this vivid memory, like this flashback. He said, statistically, I don't even remember what the conversation was. It was after like one of the missionary classes. He said, statistically, out of the 14 or so of us, one of us is going to go home. And I have the specific memory at the time, again, probably wanting to be heroic, thinking, well, that's not going to be me. Like, I would never let that happen. And then we fast forward to, I've been out like 3 months. And I was just like, I don't know what else to do. And we talked to the mission president, and he said, well, Elder, you've been faithful. And I'm like, that's nice, but that's not very helpful right now. And he knew, like, I think probably from talking to my companion, that it wasn't addiction. Like I didn't have a secret porn addiction or anything like that. And I think he could tell he needs some help, but we can only do so much. I think there are probably better or more resources now. Had I gone out now, I may have been able to have been out longer. But for me, I feel like it was a combination. I wouldn't just say all necessarily just anxiety, but a combination of not being adequately prepared because I hadn't lived away from home at the time. And I was woefully unprepared in some ways. It is a very intense, rigid schedule, even under the best of circumstances. So I think part of it was what they term general anxiety. And I've had stressful situations in my life since then, but I didn't know that at the time. And so they flew me home. So that was one of those differences that mine turned into a 3-month mission. And it was an intense mark of shame, if that's the right term, like maybe not quite like a scarlet letter type thing, but I had no idea what to do with being a failed RM. And I think now they have more help, even for those who either couldn't get sent out originally because of like health, whatever health related or medical release issues. They have a lot more of, I think, like Facebook or digital service mission type options or locally. That wasn't nearly as much the case 20 years ago. I did consider at times when I came back doing something like that, but I just was not in a very healthy place at the time. So that was basically it, at least my 3-month mission. I came back and my parents were sympathetic, and I felt even worse because by that time, I had mentioned briefly, but my 2 younger brothers were there too. My one younger brother, he's 13 years younger, so he was like 6. They were very young then, but my youngest brother was like 3 at the time. And I remember feeling like I'm the oldest. I'm the example. And I totally failed. And I did not have the emotional maturity or understanding to be able to put that in context, like for what my challenges were. So after that, for a little while, they took me to Salt Lake psychologists and whatnot. And that's where I started becoming, and later became a lot more independent, I would say, in terms of taking charge of my own health. My dad was always a great example of that, because I probably got rotated through like 10 different anti-whatever, anxiety, maybe even depression meds at the time. And from what I recall, over a period of months, it caused me to gain like 20 pounds. It caused me to sleep like 12 hours a day. And I was just more of a wreck in terms of before I went out. And I don't mean to just broadly categorize or give a generalized statement like medication or medicine doesn't help, because I absolutely believe in some cases it does. For me, it was not the answer, because even if I had some sort of anxiety imbalance, I had experienced so many of the side effects that the pros did not outweigh the cons with them.
I think there's a huge misconception about mental health and what mental health actually is. I actually believe mental health is physical health, because your brain is part of your body, right? So I actually believe that it is physical health. And I think if we understood that, then we would understand what we need to be giving our body in order to heal from these mental symptoms that are manifesting in themselves. And it's a hard road, but when we understand what causes it, like I remember my anxiety lightening up so much just from giving up sugar. Like who knew that something so simple would help with anxiety, right? Why are they not teaching this in some of our most important institutions?
I've wondered the same thing. And admittedly, I have off and on had sugar, but you're an excellent example of something else I could do.
It helps, I promise.
I think on a serious note, that was one of the issues, because even now on my mission, I had a general conception of eating healthy or healthily in terms of nutritionally. I was never a huge like soda drinker, but I would have desserts, and we got fed a lot like as missionaries.
Right.
And I would eat whatever, including sugar. And that was a hard lesson I had to learn after I got back.
Oh, me too. Me too. I love sugar growing up. So good thing we can learn, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's transition. So you come home from your mission, probably devastated and feeling more shameful than ever in your life, which in my perspective is so sad because you seem like such a good, pure kid. And here's all the shame being heaped on you. Okay, so what did you do to manage it? And then maybe go into kind of your young single adult years now.
So at that time, I had zero interest. If I had interest before in dating, it was a while after that. But that was the start of, I'd say, really maturing in some ways, because I used the term carefree when I was a kid, and even to some degree as a teen, because one of my central motivations was, aside from having a genuine desire to be spiritual and qualify for blessing, it was about fun as a kid. Like, where's the place I can have the most fun? And to be clear, for me, it usually meant Nintendo, or I've always been a huge reader. My idea of a good time and clubbing was the library. I've always been a library guru, even growing up. That's how it was.
The library is your definition of clubbing.
Was.
You're doing good.
I was living it up.
Just living it up in the library. That's glorious.
At the library. So that was my background. And at least when I got back, I didn't feel like doing much of anything. Like there was, even after, as I recall, several months of going to these appointments and feeling just frustrated by Western medicine overall, I think at some point, like my parents were pretty concerned, because originally I think there was still kind of hope, like, well, maybe he could go back out. And then realizing it was probably especially hard for my father, because he could probably see to some degree like an echo of himself, like, because he dealt with more so in his case like depression, but probably some anxiety. He's had a few times where he's had to work through some things, and that's something I've come to empathize a lot more after that. And if there's one thing I could say that I've learned specifically, it's learning more empathy and compassion for others, especially with mental health challenges. And I don't say that in the sense of being able to compare, because I've had it pretty easy overall. Maybe that was part of the issue, or some of my own lessons I had to learn. We have our own unique individual lessons. And for me, it was just devastating, because my parents were as sympathetic as they could be, and they took me through that. But the point was, I had to learn a lot of that myself. And to their credit too, my home ward was very sympathetic. I feel like it was the best overall environment I could have been in, because I've heard even some of the other interviewees episodes where it's like, I had an awful ward. Or even with your own, I think you're saying like you had a lot of, whether it was gossiping or even with your own father, as I recall, as the bishop, like rumors and backbiting and just all sorts of things.
But at the end of the day, it's like, well, obviously I'm going to have anxiety when I'm 18 after all that.
like anyone.
Who wouldn't?
Would.
Right?
Exactly.
Yep.
So in my case, that was where there's even more of a disconnect, because it was like outwardly, it was as ideal as it could have been. I did not have any abuse. I had very supportive and loving overall leaders. They were human too. There were a few times they lost their temper, but I did not have that kind of trauma. And they were as supportive as they could have been. When I went back to church, the Bishop Rick, counselor, he did say over the pulpit, Elder J. Ford has been medically, he did say honorably medically released. And I still have that vivid memory at the time, like, this is anything but honorable. This is not what a hero does or has. If they have happened to them, this is not their behavior. This is not the outcome of that. So they were as supportive as they could have been, at least outwardly. I didn't have anyone at least outright judging or going after me or whatnot. I'm sure, like, it's just human nature to wonder. I'm sure there were some who really wondered, did he have some sort of addiction? Did he sleep with someone? Like, it was none of that, but it's just human nature. It's like nearly impossible not to have some sort of wondering, like, at least with that. But
Well, and it makes you wonder how much we wonder about how people wonder.
right.
Like, how many people probably thought maybe it was an honorable release too.
Right.
But we put
yeah.
so much pressure on ourselves because we're not teaching these things with balance, like what we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. So I don't mean to say that to assume like most of them were, because to be fair, the vast majority probably were thinking, well, he did the best he could. It's just in that frame of mind.
Yeah.
It's not easy to.
Well, and how many
acknowledge
personal
that.
conversations do we have in the church with individuals where we actually go up and ask them,
Right.
like, why did you come home from your mission early? You know, that would solve a lot of things.
If there's one thing I definitely learned from that, it's that type of experience and that label with being a failed RM, one, to me at least, felt worse than not going out at all. But I'm grateful still. I went out. And along with that, recognizing later too, a lot of what we do and did in the church was very surface level. And there's this undercurrent of like even passive aggressiveness. It seems kind of foreign or strange to those who haven't been in that environment. But I didn't really have a conception of that. Fast forward like months later, overall I learned, aside from just lots of prayer and spiritually seeking, I think I read a lot of scriptures during that time. I don't remember being super zealous, at least about, let's go back to church. Like with them wondering, wait, well, why are you here now? And well, let's give you a calling type of a thing to keep you active. Like that was kind of the mentality in some ways, I think. But for me, aside from just really struggling to understand and work to draw closer, at least to Jesus, like help me understand, what do? I don't know what to do with my life now, because this is not the outlined path. It is not go out for a few months. Okay, come home, you get a free pass.
Well, and it's interesting how much we pack our identity into the check boxes that we're supposed to do in the church. So my identity is, doing all these things like in the youth, check. And then having my callings, check. Going on a mission, check. Getting married in the temple, check. And this is your identity. So when all of a sudden all the check boxes don't work out, when life is a mess, which life is a mess for everybody, if y'all haven't figured that out yet, life is a mess for everybody. And when it's a mess and it doesn't fit into that box anymore, then where does our identity lie? Our identity gets crushed under that. And so that's why when we have our identity in Christ, nothing can crush it. But we're not learning these things in the church.
Exactly. Very eloquently put. Thank you. Probably more so than I could have put into words.
Well, you're illustrating it beautifully.
Well, thank you. But yeah, that's an excellent point. And something I did want to mention just along with and not to overhype like the inferiority or worthiness complex, because I did have happy times. It's just, I feel like more often than not, there was more stress and anxiety and frustration for me, even in the most ideal of ward circumstances, than there needed to be.
Yes.
Within the LDS youth culture. I want to make sure I didn't forget that for me, so much of it was so procedural, was so much, this is the path, and maybe even more so now in some ways, at least with their covenant path, trademarked. I'm sure if they want to, they could trademark the term if they haven't already.
Yeah.
But for us, I feel like the more apt analogy may have been like the iron rod. Like that was more of the trendy term, if there was like a trendy term.
A Mormon trendy term.
Like hashtag iron rod or whatever. A lot of my outlook and mode of operating within the church was this meritocracy, like this achievement-based mentality, which served me well later on, like in school or just being an overachiever in general. Like even with my first teen job, I was Bob, or box office boy, as my dad liked to say at the local theater, like the Megaplex Theater. And I did learn a lot of good things from that. And I got rewarded in the sense of I was Employee of the Month. I still remember November 2001. And for years, I had that on my resume until finally it was like, you can let go of this now. That was in the past. But that's how I operated, like my mentality. My 3 grace achievements, I would say, that I, at least as indicated on my resume, were Employee of the Month at the theater, the Megaplex, black belt in Taekwondo. And that has a very overall meaningful, special feeling for me. Like in that sense, that's a very meaningful achievement, I think is what I was attempting to say. And I almost forgot to mention it, late bloomer as I was compared to some, but I did get my Eagle Scout. I was a week before turning 18, or it was a week before my 18th birthday. And after age 13, they really didn't focus on merit badges because you have to have so many merit badges, and then you have to spend 6 months time, 4 to 6 months per rank to rank up. And so I had been a Life Scout, the one right before Eagle, long enough that I could barely make it. And I was just kind of rushing to finish those last few merit badges. But I'm very grateful for myself that I got that third top achievement. And so to emphasize also, there were very positive aspects about my upbringing within the church. So that didn't translate as well to recovering as a failed missionary. It almost felt like recovering as an addict in some ways, like in terms of like some of the hardships. And I don't mean to say I identify or can understand what addicts go through, whether it's porn or drugs, etc., like my grandparents' alcoholism. At the same time, you have to go internally, I feel like to some degree, to be able to get to know yourself and to be able to determine and figure out what is it I need to succeed, like if that makes sense. That's kind of my general thought process with that. And probably the biggest things that helped me, at least when I got back, again, a lot of this was due to a great example of my parents. For me, it was, well, under the overall umbrella, I would say balance again with exercising, having regular exercise. For me, it generally meant weightlifting, cardio, just being physically active, sleeping well, because that was one thing that got thrown completely out of whack, at least on my mission, and having not just more or less a regular sleep schedule, because we all get out of whack at times, but focusing on getting the sleep you need. Because if you're not feeling well physically, you're not likely feeling well mentally, emotionally, and from what I learned, spiritually too. And just eating well, like you gave the example of not just sugar, but having a balance again in food, whether it's, I know we can all eat more fruits and vegetables, but cutting back even on like processed or
eat
refined
organic, folks.
foods. Eat organic.
I have to be that person that says that.
There's a lot of truth actually in that.
Yeah.
And just in general, with not eating as many treats or cutting back on fried foods or whatever it is. I'm not saying any one specific way. As Americans, we're generally very unhealthy when it comes to acceptable culture in society with what we're eating. And the epidemic we have of obesity and health
chronic
issues.
disease,
Right.
obesity, anxiety, depression. It's crazy. And a lot of it is contributed to what we are eating. The standard American diet is the sad diet.
The
It is
sad diet.
poisoning us.
Exactly.
Poisoning us.
And it made me very sad with overall eating that way.
Yeah.
I've been better since then. That was almost 20 years ago. I've had very much kind of ups and downs, but overall, I'm a lot more mature and aware of it. I'm feeling physiologically not very well. I'm having racing thoughts or literally racing heartbeat, increased blood pressure. And I've gone through enough experiences to know, have I been eating sugar lately, or have I not been eating a very balanced diet, or have I been even stress eating to some degree, things like that.
It's interesting how we have these like simple, basic life skills realizations like later in life. Like, why are we not being taught this in kindergarten, first grade, second grade? Like, all of our major institutions are failing us. So you have the public school system. Obviously, you didn't learn that. Failing. The church system. Didn't learn that. Failing. Okay, what? We have all these institutions to put our children in, yet our children are not learning the basic life skills that is going to help them to grow up and be a good man and woman who can then go and raise a family and live for God. It's crazy. Like, what's with our modern institutions? Like, corruption. That's what's with it.
Unfortunately, I would agree with that assessment. To my parents' credit also, my dad, more than the average dad probably, he did harp on eating well and even vitamins. And to him, swear words are still, like, I just visited with him the other day, things along the lines of HFCS. I had to think of like the acronym, high fructose corn syrup, and MSG, monosodium glutamate, and hydrogenated oils and soybean oil, and vegetable oil. So to my dad's credit, he did actually teach a lot of that even before I left. And some of that I had to learn the hard way.
This is the problem with all the institutions we put our kids in. Okay. When the family is disappearing because of all the institutions, church, school, whatever it is, the family, that is your responsibility in the family to teach your kids those basic life skills. And I believe there's parents that are doing that, and there's parents that are relying on the institutions, and the institutions are not going to do it. They're just not.
And I can fully admit I could do a better job of that with my own kids, but
couldn't we all?
The other day, at least, for example, some of my kids were like, and not to just call out one name brand, maybe I'll just say a very popular brand of peanut butter sweetened with sugar and fully hydrogenated oils. They were like, we love this one, we want it. And I'm like, do you know how many hydrogenated oils this has? Do you know how much sugar? I'm like, oh no, I'm turning into my dad, my father, in some ways. So I credit him with that. Like, he has been a very good overall example, but I just illustrate and highlight him specifically with that because he was actively actually teaching me that in the 90s before that was as mainstream and trendy as it is.
I love how being healthy is like trendy, but it's not at the same time.
I guess it depends what your angle is with that or
no
motivation.
Yep.
But over time, over the next year, because this would have been like 2003, I did start climbing out of that, what felt like a personal pit, like in some ways, that guilt, the shame. It was still, to be honest, years before I really felt comfortable enough with my closest, whether it was teammates, coworkers, friends, or even family in general, discussing that openly. Like, to see where I was there to the point now of publicly talking about it, that's a huge difference, at least for me, because at the time too, I did compare. I know it's so easy to make comparisons because the aspect about that was probably the hardest for me, or one of the hardest aspects, was physically I look fine, and even mentally, like I had been almost hoping for, what if it's not hoping really, but like a brain tumor or some medically accepted diagnoses where people would understand more. Like, if that makes sense.
Oh, totally. It's the same with Lyme disease. You say Lyme disease and everybody goes, what? And if you say cancer, people,
Like, oh,
give you money and sympathy and free cars. Like, it's just really weird.
Exactly. And so that's how I felt. And in some ways, I definitely wouldn't say, maybe it would have been better had it been something like more identifiable. I wouldn't really like hope at all for like, there was another young man in our ward. He did go on a mission and he came back. It was something like after 6 months or whatnot and he had to have like back surgery. So I definitely wouldn't say I'd rather have back surgery type of a thing. It's just you get in a twisted, irrational state of mind where it's like, it's more of and this was a large part of my whole church life too, this external validation aspect that can get really twisted.
Well, there's also a lack of just being real with people, I think, in society and the church. So like if you would have had like lots of people just being real, asking you questions, talking to you, offering you grace, we get in this headspace because we're just trying to put this outward appearance out there. We don't need to be in that headspace when we have people we can just be real with. It's very healing to the human heart.
And that's something I feel like I have learned much more effectively, to be more real and genuine and even vulnerable, whether it's within my own family, like my wife or even my parents, or even as it's appropriate to like coworkers, or teammates or friends, like in general.
All right, let's transition. So you got home from your mission. Now, you're healing. You're starting to heal anyway. When did you meet? Well, okay, we know when you met your wife.
Years before.
Yes. So when did you figure out that she was your wife?
When I married her. I figured out at that point.
Thank you.
That's a definite clue. But I think you wanted more.
Yeah. Okay. So like what happened before you married her?
So she was actually a big part of helping me heal in some ways.
Okay.
Like on a more serious note. I'll back up just a little bit for context. When I was still out on my mission, I did greatly value, and I'm sure now it'll be more or less email generally, but just regular letters. So I remember Karen, my wife, would write me letters, and even in the MTC, she was always super diligent about it. And even my sister-in-law, her younger sister Marie, would write me too. And both of them would sign it, your sister Karen or your sister Marie. And actually we had another high school friend that will come into play more later, but Jason, my now brother-in-law, married another of our high school friends, Sherelle, and she wrote me. And I was very appreciative of her letters because I do specifically remember she sent me, I think actually gave me and Jason, because we are just friends, or we were all friends, in high school, a color changing like pen. It was like high tech at the time where you push it up, the blue ink would pop up in red.
I remember those pens.
And so those may seem small now, like those letters or little gifts or whatnot. Aside from that, Karen and Marie would write me, and they were really nice letters. And I was like the quote adopted brother, right, in my in-laws family at the time. So that got kind of weird later, obviously, when we started dating. So she stopped signing things like your sister. But when I got back and was going through some of this healing process and just feeling like junk, just like, now what do I do? There's no real process aside from maybe a little bit here and there, like in the bishop's handbook about how to deal with return missionaries. I'm sure there's something about that, but it wasn't talked about as much. Nowadays, I feel like missionaries get sent home more for quote apostasy than medical issues, but that's another issue. But at least at the time, they did what they could, I feel like, because this was early 2000s. It was a different world in some way. So in any case, I'm home, I'm struggling. I'm just like, well, now what do I do? Because the church really was my core identity. And I feel like I was just aimless and kind of lost in some ways. And through, like I said, great examples of my parents and exercising, eating well, sleeping well, having balanced habits, I did get better. And it still was a little while before I started working, because I got to the point where it was like, well, that's in the past. I'm probably not going to do a service mission or whatnot, just with the way events unfolded. But when I got back, some months after, my now father-in-law encouraged Karen to hang out with me. And admittedly, she would admit this, that it was kind of a pity friend thing at first. Like, oh, well, I was writing him. And she was very sweet. She was sympathetic. It's just very much how the church is, with conformity and conditioning.
Yep.
With, you need a pristine RM, like a successful, heroic RM. And I was not, I felt like.
Oh my goodness. When I started dating RMs, I was like, I am not impressed. What is happening? Yep.
Yeah. So I know it was kind of different for me, but I felt it even more so because I was still writing Jason, my friend, and he's out there.
Because he's still on his
He's
mission.
out in Argentina, and I'm like, I'm hanging out at home, like
with your sister.
Yeah. So it kind of turned more into that later, but in any case, she was very kind, and over that summer, at least, we started hanging out more and talking a lot, and realized, hey, we do have some common interests, and since Jason's not here, then you're my pity. I'm your pity friend. But that didn't last too long. She did admit, like, and again, I totally don't blame her. This is the church culture, that it was like, well, he was my missionary, but now what do I do? And that's not really fair to the guys or girls, like within that context. But so we started hanging out more, and I don't remember all of what we did, but eventually that kind of turned into what I would call stealth dating. Like, it was like, we joke sometimes, like friends with benefits. Eventually that led to a
stealth dating. What is stealth dating?
Dating without our parents, as far as we were being aware of it themselves. And it was kind of a sensitive time, because it was like, well, Jay just needs to heal. And over time, I did get kind of tired of being treated like I was kind of treated in some ways like I was debilitated. Maybe not quite a chronic illness, but kind of like, well, don't stress Jay out too much or whatnot. And I'm like, I'm still a human. Like,
you're like, I think I can handle it, guys.
Right. So in any case, we started stealth dating, I guess, off and on. Or at first, it was really more like friends with benefits. Like, one night we did have our first kiss in her parents' front yard, and sparks did definitely fly, and we both were like, wow, that was awesome. And I think that fall, or it might have been not that fall, but like the next year, I think in the spring, like 2004, I got a job, because I was feeling well enough, like, well, to get back on my feet. And really, for me, one of my life lessons, I feel like, is having to learn to find an identity for myself independent of the church, because I didn't know what that looked like before really my mission, for what it's worth. And so I got a job at one of the local call centers and worked there for the summer type of a thing. Maybe it wasn't quite like 6 months, but ironically, Karen wanted to get a job too, and we ended up on the same work team. So we kind of were work daters for a little while. We got to like associate in a work setting. So we've been through all sorts of experiences, and yeah, we had a common connection like that. And In that fall, she was going actually to Snow College in
Oh.
Ephraim, not too far from here,
Nope.
just barely south. So it's been a long time since I've been back in
The old stomping
this area,
grounds.
but I think she was actually back for the summer. She had gone down to Snow in 2003 in the fall, and we had sort of a long distance-ish relationship where we were on whatever MSN Messenger or whatever at the time. And she actually came back and we worked that summer together. And then I was like, well, I'm more seriously interested in actually pursuing dating, something which I was not very familiar with. And so I actually went to Snow College for that next year, at least, largely motivated by pursuing her, because she literally had like 4 guys who were interested. And I'm like, I can't
You're
let
like,
this happen.
I got to get on the table.
If I'm going to work through my own heroic hero journey, this is the next step. And so
A good woman can cause a man to do seemingly crazy things.
and for me that kind of was, but it was maybe exactly what I needed. And we actually didn't officially date for like the first semester. Like she'd want to hang out and stuff, and she was also like, well, we need to try other ice cream flavors or date other fish in the sea. And I'm like, but what if we found the one we like? So I'm like, what if vanilla is great for me? Type of a response. And so that's kind of our early college years drama. And so it did help me learn a lot because it was the first time outside of my mission that I had lived on my own, and at least on my own in the sense of away from parents and having roommates, because I had like 4 or 5 guy roommates, and it worked out that we were down the hall from 4 or 5 girl dorm roomies with Karen. Mm-hmm. So we would just walk back and forth, hang out and whatnot. And that was basically our first year, or her second year, my year at Snow. And then I ran out of money. I was like, I wasn't academic enough, or I wasn't enough of an athlete to get a substantial scholarship. So now what do I do? And I actually moved back in with my parents. We still kind of maintained a longer distance relationship. She went to Snow 1 more year, and I started up at Salt Lake Community College. And later that year, I started my tech career. I got an internship, and I thought I would be more of a programmer, but they said, we're going to put you on the software test team. And I'm like, well, what is that? I didn't know that was a real role, at least for a career. And that was almost 20 years ago. But that was some of our earlier dating time. And when we really started officially dating, like in the last semester I was at Snow, we finally did make it official, like boyfriend, girlfriend. And there was actually a few week period that she will remind me of that I said, well, maybe we do need a bit of a break the next summer. And that was a mistake. And I spent several weeks realizing, no, that wasn't the right decision. And so I owned up to that and charmed her enough that we got back together. And during her 3rd year, when I started just up at Salt Lake Community College at Slick, a few months before, I think it was something like August, like a few months before, my now brother-in-law, Jason, proposed to his wife, Sherelle. And I think it was partly like a motivation for me, like, well, I can't let him beat me, as if we were competing. But I proposed a few months later to Karen, and she said yes, happily. And so she finished up her year at Snow, and this went into 2006. So we got married in May 2006. And so that worked out. Jason was admittedly surprised. If I back up to end of 2004, when I would have come home from my mission, but I was starting at Snow then, he's like, well, I knew I had lost my best friend when you started dating. I'm like, no, dude, it wasn't really like that. But he basically said, if you ever hurt my sister, I'll hurt you a lot, type of thing. And I said, okay, noted. And we moved on. So
Okay, I won't. I'll marry her.
yeah, so it's like, how about I marry her instead? That was 18 years ago, so that pretty much worked out.
Thanks, guys, for joining us on part 1 of this episode of the Clarity Podcast. Stay tuned for part 2. It's coming your way super soon. If you guys are interested in joining us for an episode of the Clarity Podcast where you share your story of how you left mainstream religion to follow Jesus Christ, please feel free to reach out to me at clarity.podcast@gmail.com. You can also find me on my website at forgedinhisfire.com, or you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at forgedinhisfire. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us on this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast.